I was born into what appeared to be a normal middle-class household in a peaceful suburban area. My name is Tiffany Mitchell. David and Sarah Mitchell, my parents, were completely enamored with early learning strategies and child development approaches. Our home was filled with shelves of parenting literature, and Mom was constantly discussing some new theory she had come upon. Don't you think we're going a little too far, Sarah? One evening, when Mom was having trouble teaching me basic math, I recall my dad asking. I was just 3 years old. No, David. Mom urged, these are important developmental years, while displaying another vibrant flashcard. According to the books, we must begin early. In retrospect, I can't help but chuckle at how unremarkable my growth was in spite of their unceasing attempts. I wasn't a prodigy. I sat up, walked, and spoke on time. However, my parents viewed me as their first failed experiment, rather than acknowledging that each kid grows at their own speed. When my sister, Jessica, was born, everything was different. Our home abruptly changed into what seemed like a baby genius boot camp when I was 3 years old. In an effort to avoid making the same mistakes she believed she had made with me, Mom had even enrolled in special classes by that point. Their approaches to parenting Jessica were very different. Jessica had educational development tools where I had ordinary toys. Jessica had things for cognitive improvement where I had picture books. Every accomplishment became a cause for celebration. She was able to solve puzzles intended for older children. She spoke before her friends, and she was the first to walk. My haven was the home of my grandparents, Peter and Eleanor Mitchell, who lived a few blocks away. They gave Jessica and I the same amount of love and care, treating us in the same way. One Sunday afternoon when I was around 5 years old, I recall sitting on Grandma Eleanor's knee while she read stories to Jessica and me. Grandma would give us each a cookie and remark, "Both of my granddaughters are perfect just the way they are." This usually appeared to annoy Mom, who would say something about recognizing great talent while pursed her lips. During a family meal, Grandma once forcefully stated, "Sarah, children need love, not pressure. They aren't scientific tests." Dad immediately defended Mom by saying, "Mom, you don't understand modern parenting. Jessica has genuine promise. We must foster that." As I sat there shoving peas about my plate, I realized that, to my parents, I was only the draft, the practice run, before they made their masterpiece. For me, elementary school was a very typical experience. In my class, I wasn't at the top, but I wasn't at the bottom either. I completed my homework, made friends, and overall relished being a typical child. I considered it totally acceptable that I had a lot of B's and the rare A on my report cards. But my folks hardly gave them a look. Then came the day Jessica entered school, but my sister received very different treatment than I did, even though I attended the public school in our area. At supper one night, Mom excitedly declared, "We've enrolled Jessica in the Wellington Academy for Gifted Children." They were quite impressed with her test results, but they don't often accept children this young. Choking on my milk is something I recall. Wellington was that upscale private school across town, the one with the Olympic-sized pool and sprawling campus. Their tuition is more expensive than a vehicle. The expenditures continued after then. Our parents' response was to throw money at the issue whenever Jessica had a fit about homework or complained about the burden. Jessica used to complain, "I don't want to do math today. It's too difficult." Mom used to say, "Tell you what, sweetie. We can go to the toy store and get that new dollhouse you wanted if you finish your homework." Jessica was able to figure out this game really quickly. Before long, each small achievement had a cost. Am I eligible to receive the new iPad if I receive an A on this test? Or if you buy me those designer shoes, I'll get extra credit. In the meantime, I worked on my schoolwork by myself at our kitchen table without any incentives or special treatment. I once received the best grade in my class for a scientific project that involved building a model of the solar system. When I showed Mom what I had spent weeks making, she simply nodded and remarked, "That's nice, honey." Did you hear that Jessica was admitted into the program for advanced mathematics? When I was 13, the last straw, I had just completed adorning my room, which was the larger of the two children's bedrooms, with pictures of myself with my friends and posters of my favorite bands. Although it wasn't very elegant, it served as my haven and place of refuge. Our parents were watching TV one evening when Jessica barged into the living room. She put her fists on her hips and said, "I want Tiffany's room. Mine is too small for all my things, and I need more space for my study area." I was sure that our parents would reject this absurd request, so I looked up from my book. Rather, Mom and Dad looked at each other. "You know, that makes sense," Dad said. "Jessica does have a lot more equipment and educational materials." "What?" "No," I protested. "That's my room. I've had it since I was little." But my objections fell on deaf ears. The very next day, while I was at school, they moved all my things into Jessica's smaller room. When I came home, I found Jessica already settled in my old room, her expensive desk taking up the space where my bed used to be. "This is so unfair," I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "Life isn't fair, Tiffany," Mom said dismissively. "Your sister needs the space more than you do. Don't be selfish." I slammed the door to my new, smaller room and collapsed onto the bed that barely fit in the space. That night, as I stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, I realized something important. In this house, I would always come second. High school graduation was approaching, and I'd spent months researching colleges, writing applications, and dreaming about my future. I had decent grades and some good extracurricular activities on my resume. While I wasn't aiming for Harvard or Yale, I had my sights set on several solid state universities with strong business programs. That fateful family dinner started like any other. Grandma and Grandpa had come over for Mom's Sunday roast, and we were all seated around the dining room table. Jessica was bragging about her latest academic achievement, while Mom and Dad beamed at her with pride. "So, Tiffany," Grandma Eleanor turned to me with genuine interest. "Tell us about your college plans. Where are you thinking of applying?" I straightened up in my chair, excited to finally share my plans. "Well, I've been looking at State University's business program there." "Oh, about that," Mom cut me off mid-sentence, setting down her fork with a sharp clink against the plate. "We've been meaning to discuss this with you, Tiffany. Your father and I have decided we won't be able to help with your college tuition. We need to save all our resources for Jessica's education. She's got a real shot at the Ivy League, and that's not going to be cheap." "You can't be serious." Grandpa Peter's fork clattered onto his plate. "What about Tiffany's future?" Mom sighed as if she were explaining something obvious to a small child. "Look, we have to be realistic here. Jessica is gifted. She has real potential. Tiffany is ordinary. She can get a job right out of high school or maybe take some community college classes if she saves up." "How dare you?" Grandma's voice shook with anger. "How can you dismiss your own daughter like this?" "Oh, please," Dad snapped, his face reddening. "Let's not pretend here. Tiffany's never shown any exceptional abilities. Higher education would be wasted on her. We're just being practical." I couldn't take it anymore. The walls felt like they were closing in. Shoving my chair back, I ran from the table, tears already streaming down my face. Behind me, I could hear the continued argument, my parents' so-called logic clashing with my grandparents' outrage. A gentle knock came at my door about 15 minutes later. "Tiffany, can I come in, sweetheart?" It was Grandma Eleanor. I didn't answer, but she came in anyway, sitting on the edge of my bed. Her warm hand started rubbing circles on my back, just like she used to do when I was little. "Your grandfather and I have made a decision," she said softly. "We're going to pay for your college education. All of it." I rolled over, wiping my eyes. "What? But that's too much money." "Nonsense," she smiled, reaching out to brush my hair from my tear-stained face. "You deserve an education just as much as anyone else. More, actually, because you've worked hard for it without any support." For the first time that evening, I felt myself smile. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I realized I didn't need my parents' approval anymore. I had people who believed in me, and more importantly, I was starting to believe in myself. College life suited me perfectly. Away from my parents' constant comparisons and criticism, I flourished in the business program. My professors praised my analytical thinking, and I discovered I had a natural talent for understanding market trends and investment strategies. Every weekend, I'd call Grandma and Grandpa to update them on my progress. I hadn't spoken to my parents since leaving for college. They hadn't tried to contact me either, which honestly made things easier. The only updates I got about them came through my grandparents, and one particular call changed everything. "You won't believe what's happening with Jessica," Grandma said one evening, her voice heavy with concern. "She's completely gone off the rails. You know she got into Princeton. Your parents wouldn't stop talking about it. But apparently, once she got there, away from your parents' constant supervision, she just stopped caring about school altogether." I listened as Grandma painted a picture of my perfect sister's dramatic fall from grace. Jessica, it seemed, had discovered parties, boys, and the freedom to do whatever she wanted. Her carefully cultivated image as the family genius crumbled in a matter of weeks. "Your mother called me in tears yesterday," Grandma continued. "The dean's office sent them a warning letter. Jessica's barely attending classes, and when she does show up, she's either late or hungover. What are Mom and Dad doing about it?" "Oh, they're beside themselves. They've tried everything, threatening to cut off her allowance, promising her a new car if she brings her grades up, even flying out to Princeton to talk some sense into her. But Jessica just laughs it off." The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of giving Jessica everything she wanted, my parents had created someone who didn't know how to handle responsibility. A month later, Grandma called with an update. "Well, it finally happened," she said. "Jessica got kicked out of Princeton, failed almost every class, and had too many disciplinary infractions to count." I could hardly believe it. The golden child, the genius, the one who was supposed to bring glory to the family name, kicked out of college after just 1 year. "She's moved back home," Grandma added. "Your parents are in shock. They keep saying there must be some mistake, that the university didn't understand Jessica's special needs as a gifted student." Over the next few months, through my regular calls with my grandparents, I learned that Jessica had settled into a comfortable routine of doing absolutely nothing. She slept until noon, went out with different guys every night, and treated our parents' house like a hotel. "Your father tried to get her to at least look for a job," Grandpa told me during one call. "She told him that work was beneath someone of her intelligence level." I felt vindicated and pleased, and at the same time, I felt relieved that I'd escaped their suffocating expectations and found my own path. After graduation, I landed a position as a junior investment analyst at Meridian Financial, one of the most respected firms in my hometown. Grandma and Grandpa insisted I stay with them until I got settled, and I gratefully accepted. The unexpected reunion with my parents happened on a Saturday morning at Marshall's Grocery. I was comparing prices on organic tomatoes when I heard my mother's voice. "Tiffany, is that really you?" I turned to find both my parents standing there, looking older than I remembered. Mom was clutching her shopping cart like a lifeline. "We've missed you so much," Dad said, his voice unusually gentle. "Why don't you come over for dinner sometime?" Part of me wanted to decline, to remind them of how they dismissed me years ago, but curiosity won out. "Sure," I heard myself say. The dinner was surreal. The same house, the same dining room table, but everything felt different. My parents couldn't stop praising my job at Meridian. Investment analyst at such a prestigious firm, Mom kept saying, "We're so proud of you, honey." James Wilson told me they only hire the best and brightest at Meridian. I could see Jessica's knuckles turning white around her fork. She had just quit another retail job, her third that year. Over the next few years, I worked my way up at Meridian. Each promotion came with new responsibilities and challenges, which I tackled head-on. My parents started inviting me to regular family dinners, and I accepted occasionally, maintaining a careful distance while allowing them back into my life. Jessica continued her pattern of short-lived jobs and longer periods of unemployment, never leaving our parents' house. She'd work as a waitress for a few months, then quit because it was beneath her. She'd try reception work, then leave because it was too boring. Everything changed again at one of our family gatherings. Jessica burst through the front door, dragging along a tall, well-dressed man in his 30s. "Everyone, this is Charles," she announced triumphantly, "my boyfriend." Charles was polite and well-spoken, clearly from money. Jessica spent the entire evening shooting smug looks my way. "See," she finally said during dinner, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "I bet you didn't expect me to find someone before you did, Miss Career Woman." I just shrugged and took another bite of Mom's pot roast. Jessica's attempt to get under my skin felt childish, especially given everything I'd achieved. My parents, however, were completely smitten with Charles. They hung on his every word about his family's real estate empire and his private school education. When he left that evening, promising to take Jessica to some fancy restaurant the following weekend, Mom pulled me aside. "Isn't it wonderful?" she whispered excitedly. "Charles comes from such a good family. They own half the commercial properties downtown. Jessica's finally found her path to success." I didn't bother pointing out that dating a rich man wasn't exactly a career achievement. Some things never changed. My big break at Meridian Financial came when I spotted a critical error in one of our major investment portfolios. The senior analysts had overlooked a pattern of high-risk investments that could have cost our clients millions. I stayed up 3 nights straight, analyzing data and preparing a comprehensive report. "Miss Mitchell, this is remarkable," Mr. Davidson, our CEO, said during the emergency meeting I had called. "How did you catch this?" I noticed inconsistencies in the risk assessment models. I explained, walking them through my findings. "If we redistribute these investments now, we can not only avoid losses, but potentially increase returns by 12%. My strategy worked better than anyone expected. Within 6 months, the restructured portfolio showed a 15% increase in returns. Clients were thrilled, and Meridian's reputation soared. I followed this success by developing a new investment algorithm that helped identify emerging market opportunities before our competitors. Then came the day that changed everything. I was called into the boardroom, expecting another routine meeting. "Tiffany," Mr. Davidson began, "we're creating a new position of investment director, and we want you to fill it." I nearly dropped my coffee cup. "Investment director? That would put me in charge of all investment strategies for the firm. It was a massive promotion, skipping several traditional career steps. The first people I called were Grandma and Grandpa. They were beside themselves with happiness and pride. I shared the news with my parents at our next family dinner. To my surprise, they seemed genuinely excited. "This calls for a celebration," Mom declared. "You must have a party." I was thinking of reserving a private room at Limon, I said, referring to an upscale restaurant downtown. I could invite the whole family and— "Oh, no, no," Mom interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. "You should have it here. Your father and I will help organize everything. It will be much more personal, more special. I'll invite all the relatives, order catering from that wonderful place on Oak Street." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself agreeing. Over the next week, I transferred money to my mother's account for the party expenses, and she kept me updated with regular phone calls. The evening started with such promise. I arrived at my parents' house wearing my favorite black cocktail dress and pearl necklace, a graduation gift from my grandparents. The house was beautifully decorated, with fresh flowers on every surface and elegant place settings at the dining table. The caterers had outdone themselves. The aroma of gourmet food filled the air. Family members were already there, mingling in small groups. My grandparents gave me warm hugs. Aunt Susan kissed my cheek, and Uncle Robert patted my shoulder. Jessica was holding court in the living room, wearing a stunning blue designer dress with Charles by her side in an expensive suit. Once all the guests had arrived, we gathered around the large dining table. I stood up, champagne glass in hand, ready to make my announcement. "I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight." "Oh, sweetie, let me." Mom jumped up, cutting me off mid-sentence. Her voice was almost singing with excitement, but not for the reason I expected. "We've gathered here today," she announced, beaming at the assembled family members, "to celebrate a wonderful occasion. Our beautiful Jessica and her wonderful Charles are engaged to be married." The room erupted in gasps and congratulations. Jessica pretended to blush while showing off a massive diamond ring I hadn't noticed before. Charles smiled proudly beside her. I fell back into my chair, my champagne glass nearly slipping from my numb fingers. This couldn't be happening. The party I had paid for, my promotion celebration, had been hijacked for Jessica's engagement announcement. Looking around the table in disbelief, I saw nothing but genuine happiness on everyone's faces. Even my grandparents were smiling and congratulating the happy couple. That's when it hit me. None of them knew this was supposed to be my celebration. My parents had invited them to an engagement party, not a promotion party. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood up, anger burning in my throat. But before I could say anything, I felt my father's iron grip on my wrist. He pulled me close, his smile never wavering for the benefit of the guests, but his whispered words were ice cold. "Don't you dare make a scene," he hissed through clenched teeth. "If you ruin this for your sister, we'll cut you off completely. No inheritance, no family, nothing. Sit down and smile." I yanked my hand away from my father's grip. "No," I said, my voice cutting through the cheerful chatter. "Everyone needs to know the truth." The room fell silent. Jessica's smug smile froze on her face. "This party," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "was supposed to be celebrating my promotion to investment director at Meridian Financial. I paid for everything, the food, the decorations, all of it. My parents took my money and turned my celebration into an engagement party for Jessica without telling me." Gasps and whispers filled the room. Aunt Susan's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "That's not true." Mom tried to interrupt, her face flushing red. "Tiffany, stop this nonsense right now." "Show them the invitation, Aunt Susan," I said calmly. "What does it say?" Aunt Susan fumbled in her purse and pulled out the cream-colored card. It says, "Join us in celebrating the engagement of Jessica Mitchell and Charles Aldrich." Charles stood up slowly, his face darkening. "You told me this was a family dinner where you'd announce our engagement. You never said anything about stealing your sister's celebration." "Charlie, baby, let me explain," Jessica started, but he cut her off. "No, I've seen enough." He turned to me. "I'm sorry, Tiffany. I had no idea." Then he looked at Jessica. "This engagement is off. I won't be part of a family that treats people this way. Look what you've done." Jessica shrieked at me as Charles walked out. "You've ruined everything. You're just jealous because I found someone, and you're still alone." Jealous. I laughed incredulously. "I'm the investment director of a major financial firm. I don't need to steal someone else's party or trap a rich man into marriage to feel successful." "That's enough," Dad roared, standing up. "You've gone too far, Tiffany. You're no longer part of this family. Consider yourself disinherited." "Fine by me," I said. But before I could continue, Grandpa's voice boomed across the table. "Actually, David," he said, standing up with Grandma, "your inheritance won't matter much. Eleanor and I have already changed our will. Everything we have is going to Tiffany." "What?" Mom gasped. Grandma said she's the only one in this family with any integrity, in a stern voice. "We've seen you push Tiffany aside and preferred Jessica for years. No more." After that, the night turned into a flurry of activity. Family members started hurrying off in embarrassment. My parents stared in startled silence as Jessica fled upstairs crying. I held my head up as I scooped up my bag and made my way to the door. I said goodbye without turning around. "Don't contact me again." 3 years have passed since then. Jessica and my parents haven't talked to me since that evening. According to rumors, Jessica is still living at home and is upset over losing Charles and his money. I disabled my parents' numbers after they made a few unsuccessful attempts to contact me. But my grandparents continue to be my pillars of support. They're more proud of my accomplishments than my parents ever were, and we eat supper together every Sunday. On occasion, when I reflect on that evening, I see that it was the finest possible outcome. I no longer had to look for acceptance from those who would never really offer it to me. I was announced as Meridian Financial's youngest CEO last week. When I told my grandparents, Grandpa opened a bottle of champagne he had been putting away for a special occasion, and Grandma broke down in tears of joy. He toasted to authenticity and to forge your own path. I grinned and lifted my glass. I was at last precisely where I was supposed to be.
I was 12 when my world turned upside down. That morning started like any other. Dad kissed me goodbye before heading to work at the construction company where he was a site manager. Mom barely looked up from her phone as he left. I remember thinking how strange it was that they used to be so different with each other. My name is Melanie Carter, and that was the last time I saw my father alive. He collapsed at work that afternoon, a massive heart attack, they said. I was in math class when the principal called me to her office. Mom was already there, her mascara perfectly intact despite the news she'd just received. "Your father's gone, Melanie," she said, her voice steady. Too steady. I broke down crying, but Mom just sat there, patting my back mechanically. That evening, I overheard her on the phone with her friend Linda. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but Mom's voice carried through the thin walls of our suburban home. "Actually, Linda, this might be for the best," she said, her voice low but clear. "Being a widow is much more respectable than being divorced. Plus, I get to keep everything without the hassle of lawyers." She laughed, actually laughed. I know. I'll play the grieving widow at the funeral. I've already picked out the perfect black dress." I sat on the stairs, my hand pressed against my mouth to keep from screaming. Dad's sister, Aunt Sarah, was the only one who seemed to see through Mom's act at the funeral. While everyone else was offering condolences to my devastated mother, Aunt Sarah just stood there, shaking her head sadly. She knew. She'd always known how Mom treated Dad. It didn't take Mom long to heal from her loss. Within 3 months, she started having a man over for dinner. His name was Richard Thompson, and he had 2 kids from his previous marriage, Brandon, who was 11, and Emma, who was 10. Mom would cook elaborate meals when they visited, something she'd never done for Dad. "Melanie, honey," Mom said one evening, her voice syrupy sweet. "Richard and I have something to tell you." I knew what was coming. The way they sat together on the couch, holding hands, Mom beaming like a teenager, it was obvious. "We're getting married," Mom announced. "Isn't it wonderful? You'll have a new father and siblings." I forced a smile, but inside, my stomach was turning. "That's great, Mom. Congratulations." Richard smiled at me, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Brandon and Emma are so excited to have a new sister," he said, but I'd seen how his kids looked at me during their visits, like I was something stuck to the bottom of their expensive sneakers. That night, I called Aunt Sarah and cried for hours. She listened patiently, then said something I'll never forget. "Sometimes, sweetie, the family you choose is more important than the family you're born into. Remember that." Brandon and Emma moved in the week after the honeymoon. They immediately claimed the best rooms in the house, including my playroom, which became Emma's art studio. When I tried to protest, Mom just said, "Don't be selfish, Melanie. We need to make them feel welcome." Mom transformed into a completely different person after marrying Richard. She'd spend hours helping Emma with her homework or watching Brandon's soccer practice, while I ate dinner alone in my room. The way she looked at Richard, it was like he hung the moon and stars just for her. I'd never seen her look at Dad that way. "Brandon needs new cleats for soccer," she'd say, or "Emma's taking art classes this summer." There was always money for what they needed. Meanwhile, I learned to stop asking for anything. Even basic things like new school supplies came with size and eye rolls, as if I was being unreasonable for needing pencils. They started taking trips together, nothing fancy, just weekend getaways to nearby cities or camping trips to state parks. But I was never invited. "You'll just be bored," Mom would say, not even looking at me as she packed snacks for Brandon and Emma. "Besides, someone needs to feed the cat." I'd end up at Aunt Sarah's house during these trips. Her small cottage became more of a home to me than our house ever was. She never had kids of her own, but she treated me like the daughter she never had. "This isn't right, Melanie," she'd say, watching me unpack my overnight bag for what felt like the 100th time. "A mother shouldn't play favorites like this." I shrugged, trying to act like it didn't hurt. "At least I have you, Aunt Sarah." One evening, when I was 16, I decided to bring up college during dinner. I'd been researching schools, dreaming about studying business management. "Mom," I said, carefully choosing my moment when everyone was in a good mood. I wanted to talk about college applications. Mom's fork clattered against her plate. "College? Melanie, we can't afford to send you to college. We need to think about Brandon and Emma's education." Brandon smirked across the table, and Emma didn't even try to hide her satisfied grin. Richard just kept eating, as if the conversation didn't concern him at all. Later that night, I cornered Mom in the kitchen. "What about Dad's money?" I asked. "He had life insurance, and he'd been saving for years." Mom's face hardened. "I've spent that money taking care of you for the past 4 years, she snapped. "Food, clothes, shelter, did you think all that was free?" "Stop being so arrogant, Melanie. You can't just demand things from me." I stood there, stunned by her cold tone and the obvious lie in her words. Dad had worked hard to save for my future, and now it was all gone, spent on her new perfect family, while I watched from the sidelines. The next weekend, I went to Aunt Sarah's house, with tears still burning in my eyes. We sat at her kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air, as I told her everything about Mom's cruel dismissal of my college dreams. Aunt Sarah listened quietly, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. When I finished, she got up without a word and disappeared into her study. I heard drawers opening and closing, then she returned with a thick envelope. "Your father came to see me about 2 weeks before he died," she said, sliding the envelope across the table. It was strange, he seemed worried, almost like he knew something was going to happen. "He gave me this, and made me promise to keep it safe until you were ready for college." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a bank statement showing a substantial savings account in my name, with Aunt Sarah as the trustee. Dad had been secretly putting money aside for years. "He said your mother had been acting different," Aunt Sarah explained, her voice soft. "He wanted to make sure your future was secure, no matter what happened. The money's been gathering interest all these years." I burst into tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude and love for my father, who'd protected me even after he was gone. "We can't tell Mom about this," I said, wiping my eyes. Aunt Sarah nodded in agreement. Over the next 2 years, I focused on my studies while keeping quiet about my college plans. Brandon and Emma took every opportunity to remind me of my supposed future. "Hey, Melanie," Brandon would sneer in the hallway, "I heard the diner downtown needs a dishwasher. Better get your application in early." Emma would join in, "Maybe if you're lucky, they'll let you bus tables too." They'd laugh like it was the funniest joke in the world. I just walked past them, my silence driving them crazy. Then came graduation day. I'd barely taken off my cap and gown when Mom and Richard called me into the living room for a serious discussion. They sat on the couch like judges about to pass sentence, while I stood before them. "Melanie," Richard began, his voice stern, "you're 18 now. We've been generous, but you need to understand that you can't live here forever. You need to find a job and start earning your own living." I smiled calmly. "I understand completely. I'll be moved out by next week." They exchanged surprised looks. Clearly, they'd expected resistance or tears. Mom opened her mouth like she was going to say something, then closed it again. "Well, good," Richard finally managed. "That's very mature of you." Neither of them asked where I planned to go or how I would support myself. They were too relieved that I'd agreed so easily to risk asking questions that might complicate things. Moving day arrived faster than I expected. I packed my life into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. It was surprising how little I'd accumulated over the years, almost like I'd been subconsciously preparing for this moment all along. Aunt Sarah pulled up in her blue Honda at exactly 9 in the morning. I watched through my bedroom window as she parked, half expecting Mom or someone else to come see what was happening. But the house remained silent, even though I could see movement behind the curtains of Emma's room. As we drove away, I watched my childhood home shrink in the side mirror until it disappeared completely. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt lighter with each mile we put between us and that house of carefully crafted pretenses. I spent that summer working at the Sunshine Cafe, serving coffee and sandwiches to regulars who always tipped well and treated me like family. The owner, Mrs. Peterson, even let me pick up extra shifts when I wanted to save more for college expenses. September came, and I boarded a plane to start my new life at Marshall State University, 3 states away from everything I'd known. The business management program was challenging, but I threw myself into it completely. My roommate, Jessica, became my first real friend since middle school. She didn't know my whole story at first, but when she did learn about it, she just hugged me and said, "Their loss, girl. Their loss." Mom's Facebook page became my window into the life I'd left behind. There they were, the perfect family, smiling at Brandon's soccer tournaments, celebrating Emma's art show victories, taking vacation selfies at the beach. The captions always read like marketing copy, "So proud of our amazing kids," or "Nothing better than family time." I was never mentioned, not even once. It was like I'd never existed. Holidays were spent at Aunt Sarah's, cooking together and watching old movies. We created our own traditions, and they meant more to me than any forced family dinner ever had. Sometimes she'd catch me looking at Mom's social media posts and gently take my phone away. "Don't torture yourself," she'd say. "You're making your own story now." And I was. I graduated summa cum laude, with job offers already lined up thanks to my internships and academic performance. Jessica's father, Mr. Reynolds, ran a major marketing firm, and he'd noticed my work during a class project showcase. "We need sharp minds like yours," he said during my interview. "Your professors speak very highly of you." I started in the junior analyst position, but I wasn't content to stay there. I worked late, took on extra projects, and studied market trends in my free time. Within 5 years, I'd been promoted twice and had enough savings for a down payment on my own apartment. The day I signed the mortgage papers, I stood in my empty living room, keys in hand, and finally let myself cry. They were happy tears, tears of pride, of accomplishment, of knowing that I'd made it on my own terms. Then came the biggest surprise. Mr. Reynolds called me into his office one morning, about 7 years after I'd started at the company. "We're creating a new position," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Senior Director of Strategic Development. The board and I agree you're the right person for the job." I opened the folder and nearly gasped at the salary figure. It was more money than I'd ever imagined making, especially at my age. I never saw the point in broadcasting my life online. Sure, I had social media accounts, but I mostly used them to share occasional photos of sunsets or coffee shops. Aunt Sarah was the only one who knew about my promotions, my new apartment, or the sleek black Mercedes I'd bought myself as a reward for landing the director position. "You've earned every bit of it," she'd say proudly whenever I shared my achievements with her. Meanwhile, Brandon and Emma's social media feeds were like endless highlight reels of mediocrity. Brandon would pose next to his used Hyundai Elantra with captions like "Living the Dream," "Blessed," "Luxury Life," while Emma shared photos of herself at the local mall, tagging designer brands she clearly couldn't afford. One post particularly made me laugh. Brandon standing next to his car at some local car show, writing, "When hard work pays off. Success, entrepreneur." I was reading this while sitting in my Mercedes-AMG, worth more than his annual salary, but I didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Then came the message that changed everything. It popped up on my Facebook one Tuesday morning. "Melanie, it's your mother. My 55th birthday is coming up next month, and I'm having a celebration at an expensive restaurant, Le Blanc. You've probably never heard of it. I expect you to attend. It's on the 15th, 7 p.m. sharp. Don't embarrass me." I stared at the screen, reading the message multiple times. 12 years of silence, and this was how she reached out? No, how are you? No attempt to bridge the gap. Just a command to appear at her party, with that subtle dig about the restaurant's price point. I almost deleted the message right there. But something stopped me, curiosity, maybe, or the desire to see what would happen. I called Mr. Reynolds and requested a week off, then booked a flight to my hometown. That evening, over tea in her cozy kitchen, Aunt Sarah asked the question I'd been pondering myself: "What are you planning to give her?" I smiled, pulling out my phone to show her the confirmation email. A luxury vacation package to the Maldives. 2 weeks at a 5-star resort, first-class flights included. Worth about $15,000. Aunt Sarah's eyes widened. "Melanie, that's too much. She doesn't deserve it." "Oh, I know she doesn't," I laughed, taking a sip of tea. "But can you imagine her face when she realizes what she's been missing all these years? The daughter she threw away turned out to be more successful than she could have imagined. I want to see her reaction when she realizes just how wrong she was about me." "You're a little bit evil," Aunt Sarah chuckled, shaking her head. "I love it." The evening of Mom's birthday, I slipped on my Chanel dress, elegant in its simplicity, with a price tag that could have bought 10 of the flashy outfits I spotted later that night. I deliberately took a taxi to the restaurant, amused by how this would play into their assumptions about my life. Le Blanc turned out to be exactly what I expected, the kind of place that impressed people who'd never eaten at a truly high-end restaurant. The kind of place that served frozen seafood but put gold leaf on the desserts. I'd had business dinners at places that made this look like a diner. The hostess led me to a private room where the party was already in full swing. Mom sat at the head of the table, wearing a sequin dress that sparkled under the chandelier. Richard was beside her, and Brandon and Emma flanked them like royal heirs. The rest of the seats were filled with relatives I hadn't seen in over a decade: Aunt Linda, who used to pinch my cheeks too hard, Cousin Rachel, who always bragged about her kids, and various other faces from my past. Mom's eyes barely flickered over me before her lip curled slightly. "Oh, Melanie, you came. You could have dressed up a bit more for the occasion." I took my seat at the far end of the table, watching the show unfold. Aunt Linda gave Mom a scented candle set. "It's from that nice shop at the mall," she explained proudly. Mom cooed over it like it was diamonds. Cousin Rachel presented a gift card to a local spa. "For a day of pampering," she announced. More excited squeals from Mom. The gifts continued: a cookbook, a decorative vase, a basket of bath products. Mom treated each one like a precious treasure, making sure to emphasize how thoughtful and perfect each gift was. Then came Brandon and Emma's moment. They stood up together, grinning like they'd just won the lottery. "Mom," Brandon said, and it still felt wrong hearing him call her that, "Emma and I pooled our money to get you something special." Emma pulled out her phone and showed a photo. "It's a 65-inch smart TV. We already had it delivered and mounted in your living room." Mom burst into tears, pulling them both into a tight hug. "My wonderful, generous children. I can't believe you did this. You must have saved for months. Finally, all eyes turned to me. I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, elegantly wrapped box. Mom's expression darkened immediately. What's this supposed to be? Open it and see, I suggested quietly. But she didn't. Instead, her face turned red with anger. This is exactly what I expected from you, she spat. You show up here in that plain dress, probably the only nice thing you own. You take a taxi because you can't afford a car. And now you give me this tiny box? What could possibly be in here that's worth giving? A gift card to McDonald's? She threw the box back at me. It skidded across the table, leaving a scratch in the cheap veneer. Brandon and Emma snickered behind their hands. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others seemed to be enjoying the drama. Richard just kept eating his dessert as if nothing was happening. I picked up the box calmly, brushing off the tablecloth crumbs that had stuck to its elegant wrapping. The room had gone quiet, waiting to see what I would do next. You know what's funny, Mom? I said, my voice steady. In this little box is a receipt for a 2-week luxury vacation to the Maldives. First-class flights, 5-star resort, everything included. Worth $15,000. The color drained from her face. Emma dropped her fork with a clatter. That's impossible, Mom stammered. You couldn't afford something like that. You're obviously lying. I couldn't help but laugh. You'd know whether I could afford it or not if you'd shown any interest in my life these past 12 years. But let me catch you up, I'm a senior director at Reynolds Marketing Group. I own my apartment in the city. And that taxi you mocked? I took it because I didn't want to leave my Mercedes parked in this neighborhood. Brandon's mouth hung open. Emma had stopped giggling. But since you're so convinced I'm a loser, I continued, tucking the box back into my purse, and you clearly don't want anything from me, I won't spoil your birthday any further. Enjoy your TV, I hear the resolution is almost as good as the one in my home theater. I walked out with my head high, the click of my heels echoing in the sudden silence. The maitre d' called a taxi, and I headed straight to Aunt Sarah's house. She was waiting up for me, 2 cups of tea already steaming on the coffee table. I told her everything that had happened. Some people never change, she sighed, shaking her head. Your mother's always been more interested in appearances than reality. We were still talking when my phone started ringing. An unknown number, but I knew who it was. Melanie, sweetheart. Mom's voice dripped with honey. I do not know where she got my number. I've been thinking about what happened. Have you? I replied coolly. Yes, and I realize now that I may have been hasty. If you're still willing to give me that gift, I'd love to accept it. We could use this as a fresh start. I want to be part of your life again. We're family. No, I said, finally understanding something. We're not family. We're just people who share DNA. And you didn't want to restore our relationship, you just want that vacation package. I hung up. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing after I left town. Mom called from different numbers, her cell, the house phone, even Richard's phone. When she realized I wouldn't pick up, the messages started flooding in. Melanie, please call me back. We need to talk about this. I've been thinking about what you said about your job. Maybe you could help Brandon get started in marketing? He's very creative. Emma's been saying she'd love to intern at a big company like yours. It would look so good on her college applications. The house needs some repairs, and since you're doing so well. Each message was more transparent than the last. No apologies, no acknowledgement of the past, just an endless stream of requests and hints about my money. It was like watching a desperate gambler trying to win back losses, except what Mom had lost wasn't money, It was her relationship with her daughter. I read each message with a strange detachment, like I was studying a case study for work. The tactics were almost impressive in their variety: guilt, "I'm your mother, how can you ignore me?" Flattery, "You've become such a successful woman." Manipulation, "Family should help family." And even threats, "I'll tell everyone how you abandoned your mother." "Your mother's been calling me nonstop," Aunt Sarah told me over the phone a week after I'd returned home. "She showed up at my house today, if you can believe it. Demanded I give her your address." "What did you tell her?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I told her to get off my property before I called the police," Aunt Sarah chuckled. "You should have seen her face. She kept saying she had a right to know where her daughter lives." I reminded her that she gave up that right years ago. I could picture Mom standing on Aunt Sarah's porch, probably wearing one of her expensive outfits, trying to bully her way into getting what she wanted. It was the same pattern I'd watched my whole life, but now I could see it clearly for what it was. "She didn't take it well," Aunt Sarah continued. "Started ranting about how ungrateful we both were, how she'd sacrificed everything for you. The neighbors probably heard everything. When she finally realized I wasn't going to give in, she stormed off to her car. But Melanie, be careful." She seemed desperate. "I already blocked her on everything," I assured Aunt Sarah. "Social media, phone, email, everything. And security at my office knows not to let her in if she shows up." After we hung up, I walked through my apartment, looking at everything I'd built for myself. The modern furniture I'd chosen, the art on the walls, the view of the city from my windows, all of it earned through my own hard work. I thought about Mom's messages, about her sudden interest in my life now that she knew I had money. In the end, it was almost funny. She'd thrown away a relationship with her daughter for the appearance of a perfect family, and now she was desperate to get back into my life for the appearance of success. But she'd taught me one valuable lesson: family isn't about legal documents. It's about love, support, and being there for each other through good times and bad. I had that with Aunt Sarah. The next morning, I called the travel agency and changed the name on the Maldives vacation package to Sarah Carter. When I told my aunt, she tried to refuse, but I insisted. "You deserve this more than she ever did," I said. "You've been more of a mother to me than she ever was." Aunt Sarah hugged me tight, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged.
In an impossible situation as his dad. We'll get through this together, okay? Alan squeezed my hand tightly and managed a pained smile. "You have no idea how much it means to hear you say that. Most other women would have run for the hills by now." I tried to make light of the situation. "Well, I'm too stubborn and strong-willed to let a little thing like your criminal son scare me off." We both managed a gentle laugh, momentarily breaking the tension. But as Alan headed to take a shower, leaving me alone at the table, a cold realization crept over me. The casual theft from my purse had been just the tip of the iceberg. By welcoming Kyle into our home, we'd opened the door to a world of darkness, illegal activities, violence, and God knows what other dangers. I remembered the cocky smirk on his face as he insulted me mere hours ago. There was something chillingly sinister lurking behind those eyes, far beyond the brashness of typical teenage rebellion. A shudder ran down my spine. Had I grossly underestimated the depravity of this boy? No, this man whose twisted path in life could easily bring ruin to the new dream I was trying to build? I knew in that moment that dark days lay ahead. Kyle's very presence had instantly transformed my new marriage from a longed-for sanctuary into a minefield of constantly looking over my shoulder. And as I absorbed the full scope of the situation Alan had gradually let slip, one thing became crystallized in my mind. That vile, manipulative snake was not going to take away my hard-won chance at happiness without a brutal fight. In the weeks that followed, Kyle's audacious demands and destructive behavior only escalated. It was as if he viewed our home as his personal playground, thinking he could treat Alan and I as his servants. "I need some extra cash," he declared one morning, barging into the kitchen while I prepared breakfast. "My car payment's due." I shot him an incredulous look over my shoulder. "Your car payment? Maybe you should get a job and cover your own expenses for once." Kyle sneered. "Why should I work when my dad has so much money? Just give me what I need." "That's enough," Alan interjected sternly, entering from the living room. "I'm not just handing you piles of cash whenever you want it. You're a grown man. Act like it and get a job." In a blur of movement, Kyle swept his arm across the kitchen counter, sending plates, glasses, and silverware clattering to the floor in an explosion of shattered ceramic and glass. "You ungrateful old bastard," he screamed, his face contorted into an animalistic rage. "After all the hell I went through because of you." Alan stood motionless, seemingly petrified by his son's outburst. I jumped back, gasping as shards crunched under my feet. "Get out," I growled through gritted teeth, mustering all my courage. "Get out of our house right now, before I call the police." Kyle opened his mouth to respond, but seemed to think better of it. With one last menacing glare at us both, he spun on his heel and stormed down the hallway, slamming the front door behind him hard enough to rattle the windows. Once his footsteps faded, I crumpled into a chair, struggling to fight back terrified sobs. Alan immediately moved to comfort me, wrapping his arms tightly around my shaking shoulders. His own eyes were glazed with moisture. "I'm so sorry, Marlene," he whispered hoarsely. "You never should have had to go through that." "You need to make him leave," I said, forcing the words out between shuddering breaths. "He's out of control. He's going to seriously hurt one of us." Alan drew back, cupping my face in his calloused hands. "I know, baby. After that explosion, I finally see he's too far gone." Thank God, I thought with a surge of relief. Finally, he was seeing sense. Or so I believed, until Kyle sauntered back through the front door 2 hours later, looking utterly unfazed by his meltdown. And he wasn't alone. Trailing closely behind him was a flashy woman in her late 20s with heavy eye makeup and tight, revealing clothes. Her disinterested scowl seemed permanently affixed on her face. Kyle flung his arm around her shoulders, grinning smugly at us. "Since you two don't seem to like me being around so much, I'll just have Diane here move in to keep me company." The blood drained from my face as Alan and I exchanged a look of disbelieving horror. Move his skanky girlfriend? No, this couldn't be happening. "Kyle, absolutely not," Alan warned, anger seeping back into his voice. "Don't you dare bring that kind of riffraff into our home." "Too bad, old man. It's happening," Kyle taunted. With that, he brushed past us both, pulling Diane down the hallway to what was originally Alan's study. "Oh yeah, you guys can move your little homework space to the garage," he called over his shoulder flippantly. "Me and Babe need our own bedroom." I slumped back into the chair, burying my face in my hands as the sounds of raucous laughter and thumping bass erupted from down the hallway. This nightmare was only getting worse, and my husband seemed powerless to rein in his monster of a son. Living under the same roof as Kyle and his disrespectful girlfriend Diane was a waking nightmare. Nights were filled with thumping bass from their room, shouting matches, and God knows what other disturbances. Worst of all were the little glimpses I'd catch of disturbing activities whenever I passed by their door, furtive figures coming and going at all hours, hushed conversations abruptly silenced by glares in my direction. It was becoming increasingly clear that more than just his obnoxious presence was pervading our home. Kyle was running some sort of illicit operation right under our roof, putting Alan and I at legal risk. One sweltering summer night, the hallway reeked of marijuana smoke yet again. I stormed down to their door and pounded my fist against it furiously. "Kyle, keep that crap away from our part of the house. I'm not letting you turn this into some kind of trap den." The door flew open, and Kyle's sneering face appeared in the cloud of smoke. "Back off, you dried-up old hag," he spat. "What I do in my room is none of your business." My jaw clenched with rage. It becomes my business when it's happening in my home and putting me in legal jeopardy. From over Kyle's shoulder, I spotted Diane lounging on the bed in a skimpy top, lazily scrolling on her phone as if nothing were amiss. "You want a nice, quiet home? Maybe you should have stayed a lonely widow then, instead of marrying into my family's problems." Kyle snarled. With a sudden shove, he sent me stumbling back. I lost my balance and crumpled hard onto the hallway floor, crying out in shock and pain as my elbow smacked against the wall. "That's it! You're out of here!" I heard Alan roar as he rushed in from the living room. "Don't you ever lay a hand on my wife again." He reached down to help me up, his face contorted in fury. For once, there were no hallowed pleas to his son, only unbridled rage. Kyle responded by spitting a huge gob of phlegm that landed squarely on Alan's cheek. The twisted smile on his face was one of pure malice. "Get out," Alan growled in a low, gravelly voice I'd never heard before. "Get out of my house before I bash your skull in and happily let the law deal with me after." Kyle cackled, seeming almost delighted at having provoked this normally mild-mannered man to the brink of violence. "Oh, I'll get out, old man. Just try and make me leave empty-handed after supporting my worthless life for—" Before he could finish, Alan's fist connected squarely with Kyle's nose in an explosion of blood and cartilage. Kyle crumpled to the floor with a high-pitched howl of agony. "That's for Marlene, you piece of garbage!" Alan spat down at his son, flexing his knuckles. The bravado disappeared from Kyle's demeanor as he cowered on the floor, cradling his gushing nose. "You'll pay for this," he blubbered through a torrent of blood and tears. "I'll make you miserable." Summoning whatever was left of my nerve, I forced myself to my feet and leveled an accusatory finger at Diane, who continued to sit casually watching the violence unfold. "Get this trash out of my house," I hissed. "Both of you, before we call the police and public services to forcibly remove you." For once the skanky woman's face betrayed a flicker of alarm, comprehending the very real prospect of legal consequences beyond this domestic dispute. In a flurry of motion, she gathered her and Kyle's belongings into ratty duffel bags as Alan and I watched stoically. With one last venomous look over his shoulder, Kyle allowed himself to be pulled out the front door, slouching away into the night, still cradling his battered face. Only when the rumble of their beat-up Honda had faded did we collapse into each other's arms, physically and emotionally spent from the turmoil. "I'm so sorry, Marlene," Alan rasped softly into my hair. "You didn't deserve any of this." Gently pulling back, I cupped his face in my hands and forced his gaze to meet mine. "No more apologies," I stated firmly. "That monster is out of our lives for good, and he's not taking anything else from us." Deep down, however, I knew it was too dangerous to rest on that conviction. The menacing fury in Kyle's eyes as he was ejected betrayed something far more unsettling than the tantrum of a spoiled brat. My stepson was unraveling into a vicious, vindictive menace willing to go to extremes in pursuit of revenge. And whatever dark dealings he'd been involved in, his pride and greed would never allow him to walk away without extracting a price. Alan and I had only begun to pay, but even we couldn't fathom how steep the cost would become. In the days after Kyle's explosive eviction, an eerie calm descended over our home. Alan and I walked on eggshells, constantly bracing for some form of retaliation that never came. "He has to be plotting something," I muttered to Alan one evening as we picked at our dinner in tense silence. "Kyle's not the type to just slink away." Alan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "You're probably right. I have no idea what he's capable of at this point." We both jumped as my phone began ringing, the shrill tone shattering the quiet. I felt my pulse quicken as I saw the caller ID. It was my brother Eric. "Hello?" "Marlene, it's me." His familiar voice crackled over the line. I think we need to talk, in person." There was an uncharacteristic solemnity to his tone that instantly put me on edge. Eric wasn't one to mince words or ask to meet up unless something serious was going on. "What's this about?" I asked, unable to mask the tremor of worry in my voice. A pause. "It's about your stepson, Kyle. I've been looking into a few things. We should discuss it face to face." My eyes flicked over to meet Alan's concerned gaze. This couldn't be good. "Okay, come over tonight after you get off work," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I spent the next few hours in a state of nervous agitation, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios about what Eric might have uncovered. Was Kyle pushing drugs, involved in organized crime of some kind? The possibilities were chilling. When Eric finally arrived that evening, his face was taut and grim. He made a beeline for the couch and dropped his voice to a hushed murmur, glancing furtively around as if he feared we were being watched. I've been piecing some things together through my contacts and databases at the precinct, he began in a low growl. That kid of yours, Alan, he's mixed up in some seriously dangerous stuff. Eric ran a hand over his thinning hair. Stolen identities, credit fraud, you name it. He's got an entire black market operation going, using those scumbag friends of his to siphon money and rip people off blind. I felt the blood drain from my face as realization dawned. The shadowy figures coming and going at all hours, the scrapped plans for Alan's study to become their lair, it all made sense now. That's why he was so desperate to keep you from kicking him out, Eric continued grimly. He needed to operate out of your home undetected. Guys like that, they'll do anything to keep their schemes going. Alan's face was ashen. Oh God, when I think of all the times he brought strange people around, started getting belligerent out of nowhere, he was protecting his crooked schemes all along. My brother leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as his eyes bored into ours with steely intensity. Which is why the two of you are in very real danger. Kyle clearly has no limits to what he'll do, and guys involved in this level of fraud tend to have extremely dangerous connections. The unspoken suggestion hung in the heavy silence that getting on the wrong side of Kyle's operations could mean deadly consequences. We need to handle this extremely carefully, Eric said, his expression grave. One misstep and you could find yourself swept up into a world you don't want any part of. My heart pounded in my ears as the gravity of the situation became clear. That vicious, greedy snake of a stepson had turned our home into a den of criminality. And now, he wouldn't stop until he'd exacted vengeance upon us for daring to defy him. I felt Alan's hand finding mine, gripping tightly as we digested this nightmare in silence. Our very lives could be at stake at the hands of his own unhinged son. With a resolute nod to my brother, I knew there was only one path forward, no matter how dangerous. We had to stop Kyle's malevolence, once and for all, and we would have to match his ruthlessness every step of the way to survive. Over the next few days, Eric worked feverishly behind the scenes to gather intelligence on Kyle's operation. Calls were made, surveillance footage poured over, shady contacts leveraged for any crumbs of information. Finally, he presented us with the bombshell. Kyle's crew was about to pull off a massive identity theft and fraud scheme, their biggest score yet, and he had the date, time, and location. This is our chance to nail that piece of garbage once and for all. Eric growled, slapping a thick manila folder on our kitchen table. I'll organize a sting with my unit to catch him red-handed. Alan and I exchanged anxious glances. Taking down Kyle's criminal empire was the obvious necessity, but the prospect of being intimately involved in such a high-stakes police operation filled us with trepidation. What do you need us to do? Alan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eric fixed us with an intense stare. We're going to use Kyle's greed against him. I'll have one of my undercovers reach out saying they have some high-value financial data to sell. He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. And the two of you are going to be the brokers who set up the meeting, the ones who can get him to show up in person so we can grab his slimy ass. A tense silence stretched between us as Alan and I processed what he was asking. Not only would we be dangling criminal bait in front of that viper, we'd be serving ourselves up as targets to draw his fangs. But what other choice was there? We were already marked by his venom. Leaving him to run rampant would only ensure he circled back around to strike again when we least expected it. Whatever it takes, I said firmly, squaring my shoulders as I met my brother's gaze. If being part of the sting is what's needed to finally rid our lives of that cancer once and for all, I'll do it. Alan gave a grim nod of agreement, lacing his fingers tightly through mine. 2 nights later, we found ourselves seated at a seedy bar near the industrial district, my stomach tying itself in knots as we awaited our undercover's call signaling that the trap was set. The burner phone finally rang, and I felt my heart lurch into my throat. It's go time, Alan muttered, eyes flicking around the dingy establishment as I answered the call with trembling hands. Yeah, I got a hot new bank data dump to move, the gruff voice at the other end stated matter-of-factly. You still looking to buy? Of course, I replied, struggling to keep my tone even and businesslike despite my inner turmoil. My partner and I can meet with the Merchandise in hand tonight, ready to make a deal if it passes muster. Perfect. Warehouse District, 10 p.m. Listen for my message on the burn phone with the exact location in 30 minutes. The call clicked off abruptly, leaving Alan and I to await further instructions with bated breath. True to their word, a new text arrived giving us a specific address, a derelict factory on the fringes of the warehouse district. Isolated, cavernous, the ideal setting for criminal dealings to unfold undetected, or so they would believe. As we pulled up outside the rusting gates, my brother's message crackled urgently through the phone's tinny speaker. Got you covered from all angles. Just play it cool and stay frosty. Units are in position, eyes on your target coming in from the east side. My chest tightened as the unmistakable growl of Kyle's beat-up Honda echoed off the buildings, pulling in through the far gates with its high beams blazing. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as the door slammed open, his hulking form emerging into the sickly glow of the street lamps. Well, well, he sneered as he swaggered forward, flanked by two of his slimy henchmen. If it isn't Dad and the little wifey. Despite the terror coursing through me, a surge of adrenaline-fueled determination washed over me in that moment. This soulless predator had tormented our family for the last time. With a subtle nod, I signaled that the game was truly afoot. Let the vipers ensnare themselves for one final act of retribution. Kyle swaggered forward, that same twisted smirk frozen on his face, the same one that had mocked me so many times during his reign of terror under our roof. "So what's this big score you mugs are trying to peddle?" he sneered, looking us up and down with contempt. "It better be good, or else this little reunion is gonna get ugly." I felt Alan tense beside me, but kept my own expression steely. "We'll let you inspect the merchandise first, if the price is right." Producing a weathered USB drive, I placed it squarely in Kyle's outstretched palm with a subtle nod to Eric's team lying in wait. The Viper's eyes lit up with greedy intrigue, his focus fully fixated on the promise of an illicit payday. With a grunt, he handed it off to one of his henchmen, who immediately got to work on a laptop, no doubt scrutinizing the data for any whiff of fraud potential. While they were distracted, my gaze landed on the other crony loitering nearby, idly scrolling through his phone, until I noticed the unmistakable glint of a knife peeking out from his waistband. My heart stuttered with a new surge of panic. These weren't just amateur crooks. They were strapped and ready for any potential violence. One wrong move, and this entire sting could devolve into a deadly crossfire with me and Alan caught squarely in the middle. I reached out and gave Alan's hand a subtle squeeze, hoping my brother's unit was as dialed in as they promised to be. "Looks legit," the henchman finally grunted after several tense moments, slapping the laptop closed. "Ez money, as long as your crazy-ass family ain't trying to set us up." A sly smile crept across Kyle's lips as he leveled his gaze at us. "Now why would we want to do that? After all the fond memories?" His fingers closed tightly around the USB drive, the smirk morphing into a full sneer. "Maybe we'll take this little payoff and a little extra fee from dear old Dad to make up for all the grief your bitch put me through." My jaw clenched, fury blazing inside me. Of course, he couldn't let this go without one final sadistic jab. Too much to ask for a simple ending where the snake gets what's coming to him. "You must be stupider than you look," I spat back, fists clenching at my sides. "We're not going to just hand you money, you parasite." In a flash, both henchmen produced their weapons, leveling them squarely at us. I gasped, instinctively grabbing Alan and pushing him behind me as they fanned out in a menacing semicircle. "Maybe you didn't get the memo," the knife-wielding thug snarled. "We ain't asking for money. We're taking it. Drop 'em. You're surrounded." The barked command seemed to reverberate from all directions as the night exploded in a blinding haze of flashbang grenades. I blinked and coughed, struggling to see through the smoke and spot the source of the chaos. Suddenly, what seemed like dozens of black-clad figures materialized through the haze, weapons trained in a tight semicircle around Kyle and his stunned goons. "This is the police!" Eric's commanding voice boomed over a bullhorn. "Get on the ground with your hands up!" There was a tense beat of stunned silence, until the knife-wielder made the mistake of whipping his blade in a wild, yet unpredictable arc, met instantly with a searing volley of beanbag rounds from the officers slamming into his chest and abdomen. As he collapsed, wheezing, there was one final snap of resistance as Kyle made a panicked break for his car. But my brother was prepared, rushing out of the smoke to put him in a wrenching arm lock that sent him crashing to the pavement. "Kyle Turner, you're under arrest for identity theft, wire fraud, and a whole host of other fun charges." Eric growled through gritted teeth as the cuffs clicked into place. "Anything you say or do will only make your life that much harder, scumbag." The still defiant scowl instantly drained from Kyle's face, replaced with naked terror as he finally grasped that the tables had turned and the ultimate consequences were closing in. As the officers hauled him roughly to his feet, his wild eyes met mine briefly, and I was flooded with the most intoxicating sensation of vindictive satisfaction. This sadistic tormentor who'd inflicted so much misery was finally, irreversibly, getting the brutal payback he deserved at the hands of righteous karma, and I was going to revel in every second of his downfall. The weeks following Kyle's dramatic arrest were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, lurid media frenzies, and the gradual unraveling of the tangled web he'd woven. It seemed every time we thought we'd grasped the full extent of his criminal enterprises, more sordid layers would emerge. I watched it all unfold from the gallery with a strange sense of detached amusement. The smarmy swagger, the sadistic manipulation, the sheer delusion of entitlement, all of it had finally caught up to ensnare my stepson in its unforgiving karmic trap. His wretched girlfriend Diane was wrapped up in the dragnet as well, already flipped by the prosecution and ratting out every last depraved detail in a desperate bid for leniency. At this point, she was nothing more than a bug on the windshield to me, easily swatted away and forgotten amid the larger impact headed Kyle's way. Eric was relentless, leaving no insidious crevice of their activities unturned or unpunished. Fraud, money laundering, drug trafficking. Kyle's reckoning was swift and absolute. With the mountain of evidence stacked against him, it wasn't a question of if he'd be convicted, but just how many years he'd be burying himself alive behind bars. The jury has reached a verdict. Those 4 simple words from the judge's mouth sent an electric surge of anticipation through the courtroom gallery. Kyle stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, as his team of lawyers frantically conferred one last time. The foreperson rose and cleared his throat solemnly. On the charges of mail fraud, aggravated identity theft, and drug conspiracy, we the jury find the defendant, Kyle Turner, guilty on all counts. A muted shockwave seemed to ripple through the room, punctuated only by Kyle's lawyer slumping back in her chair, utterly deflated. His lips contorted into a silent snarl, though whether out of anger or resignation, I couldn't tell. As the remainder of the lengthy verdict was read aloud, something inside me began to uncurl and unfurl. A profound lightness I hadn't experienced in what felt like an eternity. The tightness that had gripped my heart for so long steadily dissipated with every guilty issued upon my tormentor. We shuffled out through the courthouse steps into a swarm of cameras and microphones from the awaiting press, my brother taking the lead to address the media frenzy. "This case sends a clear and resounding message to those who seek to corrupt and victimize our communities," he boomed in that signature authoritative rasp. "We will pursue them to the fullest extent of the law and bring the full hammer of justice upon their heads." As flashbulbs exploded all around us, I sought out Alan's eyes amidst the chaos. He gave me the faintest of smiles and a subtle nod. The ghost of the same weary, downtrodden man who'd been paralyzed by his son's long trail of transgressions had finally been exorcised. He too seemed to feel the lightening of our collective burden. That night, after the cameras and crowds had dispersed, we sat in peaceful silence on the back patio. Cicadas droned their evening chorus under a canopy of stars twinkling brilliantly in the warm summer darkness. So much had changed, yet felt startlingly unchanged at the same time. The house was precisely as we'd left it that fateful morning, and yet the oppressive storm cloud that had followed us home from the courthouse finally felt completely lifted. "You know, I still have a hard time wrapping my mind around how far that sick bastard was willing to go," Alan said at last, cradling his beer bottle pensively. "Just to what? Punish us for not enabling him anymore?" I gave a slow shake of my head. At the end of the day, it was never really about us, just his own greed and depravity swallowing him whole. I thought back to that cold, chilling glare Kyle had leveled at me in the courtroom while receiving his sentence, not one of rage or hatred, but a fathomless emptiness. For all his blustering malice, he was now just an empty husk being justly carted away. He'll spend every day of the prime of his life rotting behind bars, I stated with grim finality, and all he'll have is that void where his soul should have been to keep him company. Alan nodded, the ghost of a smirk toying at the corner of his lips as the cocoon of our nightmare finally shed away completely. So I guess that means we get to focus on filling our lives with better things now. You know, like a little peace and happiness for once. The enormity of that simple idea hung in the air, more revitalizing than the gentle breeze kicking up around us. Pulling me close, Alan pressed his lips to the top of my head, a kiss filled with a renewed sense of purpose and the untold promise of whatever lay ahead. For the first time in what felt like eternities, the horizon was wide open and full of possibilities. I'd say we've earned every last drop of it, babe, he murmured warmly against my hair, and I can't wait to start living it.